when you said if, you become a widow and everybody judges your actions and like everything you're doing. And like you said that, it's like, just go on Facebook and someone's like, I ate bread today. And people are like, oh my God, you ate bread today.
Yeah.
Like it's literally like anything you do that's like people are like assholes and just want to, but they're projecting their own shit onto you.
Hey, and welcome to another episode of The Day After. Today we have Stacey Steinmiller on the show, who was my therapist during the years when Ariana was battling cancer and the year after she passed. We discuss how identity plays a big role after losing your partner, and even touch on some areas we worked on during my time in therapy with her. You can find Stacey online at The Radical Evolution or at radicallifecoach.com. You'll also notice that Ashley was missing from this episode. And if you're a regular listener, you know that at the end of every interview we do with a guest, we do a speed round. And last week, my questions were just so much better than hers, so she refused to come on this show. No, I'm just playing. She was sick, so she'll be back next week. She is starting to feel better. And while I have you, don't forget to rate and review the show. It goes a long way to help support us. All right, thanks, and enjoy the show. Hi, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
I guess we can start off like the purpose of this is to explore from a, we'll say from like more of a therapeutic aspect of like, what does widowhood look like, specifically widowhood and grief. I think we can say up front that you helped me a lot through this, right? As my therapist and now friend, if I'm allowed to call you that.
If you see me as your friend.
Of course I do. So I wanted to have you on because I wanted to talk about maybe even using my process as a way to kind of think through like, what is that initial grief? What are those initial phases and things that you go through when you first lose a loved one, a partner? Because I was very surprised actually what the things were that I struggled with. It wasn't necessarily what I thought it would be. And you really helped kind of shape what that first year was like and the things that I needed to focus on. But first, like we can go a little bit into kind of your background, what you did and kind of where you are right now. So if you want to talk a little bit about that before we kind of dig in.
Yeah, we can do that. And you can definitely share as much of your process as you want, like, because I do feel like it is really unique to each individual, so if you want to share those like specific examples, then we can just talk about how it is surprising or how it's not the normal 5 stages of grief thing. And, that's us trying to put everything into boxes, know? Yeah.
That I'm definitely down to do that. So you were a therapist for a while.
Yes. So I started practicing therapy in 2010, and then I opened up my practice. It's hard to really say, like, give it a date, but I started working on opening it in late 2013, and that's also when I started my EMDR training at that same time. Yeah.
Okay. And right now, so you shifted out of therapy and you do coaching now, right?
Yes. So I'm under generic life coaching title. I feel like that's not the best title, but it's what we have in our dialogue. But yeah, almost 6 months ago now, I fully closed my doors so that I could focus on it. And a big part of it is so I can serve people in a different way, because I felt really confined by the rules. I also don't like rules in general.
Yeah. And I think like it's important to like having been to you as a therapist for so many years and then like now kind of working in another way. I think there's like a uniqueness to what you bring and there was a uniqueness to kind of what you brought to me through that first year. So I guess I'll start with 2020. It ended up being a really shitty year, right? So my wife, Ariana, she had been battling breast cancer for 5 years to that point, and it really took a turn for the worse in 2020, and everything started to go downhill. It spread everywhere, and it was looking like, we were really hoping to just get her through the holidays, but she ended up passing away in September of 2020, so right before the holidays. And in some ways, I see that as a positive, as a blessing, because if it happened in the holidays, even though that's like the beginning of the holiday season, I think it would be even harder for myself and the kids to kind of go through. But anyway, so she passed away. It's something that you and I had worked a lot on and kind of preparing me for,
Yep.
because her diagnosis, we knew that it was eventually going to happen,
Yeah.
but we didn't know exactly when it was going to
Yeah.
happen. And I think the initial stages, or the initial process of kind of working through this, you really allowed this environment to exist, and it helped that we had been together for so long, but an environment to where I felt I was able to come and really just speak honestly and openly about the things I was feeling. There was a lot of isolation, there was a lot of loneliness, there was a lot of pain and anger and all these different things.
Yeah.
And out of that, the biggest thing was that I realized that my identity had to change,
Mm.
because it was always Ariana and CJ for since I was 18 years old, right? So it's like we went almost 2 decades where it's just Ariana and CJ, and then it became just CJ. And I struggled with that. And so that's, I guess, like, could you talk a little bit about what happens in those moments, like when our identity is challenged, and why it's so significant for our identity to have to change once we lose our partner?
Yeah. And also, it wasn't just like the identity as you guys as a couple, you also had this caretaker
Mm-hmm.
identity going on as well because of her diagnosis and so forth. So you cared for her in every way, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And yeah, so after she had passed, there was that she's kind of like watching me feeling
Yes, that's
um
right.
um in like, you know, both a weird way, but also just you always made decisions with her and talked to her about everything and just not having that person. And so yeah, the rug really gets, you know, ripped out from under you. And you know, even like what pushed you in work and finances was, you know, you
Mm-hmm.
wanted her to be happy and, you know, buy the things that she wanted to buy and do, you know, so every aspect of your life was fueled in this both a husband and kind of a caretaker role. And so then when that suddenly just disappears, even though you knew it was coming, but it still just suddenly disappears, there was this how do I function in the world and do all these things we do every day, not being in that husband caretaker role
Yeah.
anymore. So it's extremely foundational to, I think it's like helpful to just see that, you know, be able to like in a way visualize it, like, oh wow, my whole role is just change, you know, and allowing all those feelings, like you said, the mixture of everything to come up and work through that.
What happens? So, like, we've done. You mentioned you did EMDR. Yeah, it's EMDR, right, or
Yeah, you
EDMR?
got it
I
right.
always,
Yeah.
I always get that freaking confused. Um, which is was super helpful for me for other trauma, but in a lot of the work that we did together, we focused on like parts work.
Yeah.
So, I guess my question is, in thinking about parts work, I guess one, like, can you define that? And then two, what happens to that emotional system and that emotional regulation when our identity does get essentially taken away from us?
Yeah. So parts work, and it might depend on who you ask.
Mm,
So I'll just share about how I do it, you know. I when I do parts work, it's really organic to each individual. It's what are your parts specifically instead of these are the parts that everybody has. And yes, there's obviously like similarities because we're all humans and, you know, so forth. So I really, how I do it is I, you know, set a little calm stage, you know, and you kind of visualize these different aspects of yourself coming into a room with you. And, you know, and we had done all of that years prior. So I think so it was helpful. We didn't have to like
Mm-hmm.
reset the stage anymore. You already had this awareness of your system, which was really
Mm-hmm.
helpful, right? You know, to know of like, okay, what part of me is saying that? Because we all have these experiences where it's like, well, part of me feels this way, a part of me feels that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And with a loss, yeah, there's all these mixtures of emotions. And if we can kind of tease it out, like what part's saying that? What part's saying this? You know, it
Right.
just, I find it to be easier to like conceptualize and then work with. And it's like, okay, let's talk to this one part specifically. How is
Yeah.
this part reacting and responding? And then another part's like, okay, then it wants the stage. Okay, let's give that part the floor for a minute. Okay, well, now how does this part feel about it? So it helps to put you into that observer role, like in meditation, basically. And then you can kind of like work through that. Because, like you said, like what's happening in your system is all parts are getting disrupted, right?
Right.
It's not just one part that's getting disrupted, like all of them are freaking out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why that specifically was more helpful for you at that time. Um, because yeah, it was more about this identity and what your life looked like now and what's
Mm-hmm.
it gonna look like and what's the best thing to do versus, you know, or what do I feel I should do, you know. So there's all these
Yeah.
different voices going on versus you know, with EMDR I would use more specifically focused on you know, the point of discovery, I could call it, like when someone first finds out that their loved one had died and like that initial shock and so forth. And, you know, there was that stuff with you, but it was also different because you were with her and you got, you know,
Yeah.
to do the pictures and, you know, and stuff, you know, so it
Mm-hmm.
was just kind of you were very present in the experience of her passing. And I think, sorry, I'm kind of going off on a
No,
tangent.
no, no, no. This is good. Yeah. So, I mean, you can contrast that, right? Where it happens suddenly, potentially.
Yeah, and not saying that yours was easier. It's that you were able to be present,
Yep.
which helped your nervous system
Okay.
to accept what's happening, right?
Right.
And for all parts to be present to digest the information.
Right.
And the more we're able to digest the information, the less traumatic it's gonna be. And so I say that way, as in, like I said, that doesn't mean it's less painful or less sad. I'm saying it's the impairment in your functioning in your nervous system will look different, if that
Different.
makes
Yeah.
sense. And you can speak on it on your end. Yeah.
I remember one specific session. You asked one question, and it was so for me, right? You mentioned you kind of like everybody has their own parts instead of, there's what like the four protector parts and all these different
Right, right,
things. But
right.
with you, it was like over the years we discovered what those parts were in me. But there was one specific part, the boy, and this was a version of me, that child version that kind of exists and still exists. And I remember you asking, "Does the boy know that Ariana's dead?" And he didn't, and
Mm,
it kind of blew my mind that there was a lot happening at that time, and like we started doing that work of like, okay, like let's tell the boy like what happens, how do you respond, what do you feel, and all those things. So is like while being present to her death and her dying. So for Ariana, like we were lucky in that we got to do hospice at home, and we had the
Mhm.
family here, we had the kids, my son never left her side, and still being present to that. But there were still parts of me where it was hidden that
Yep.
this was actually happening. And I remember that very distinctly when you asked like if the boy knew, and he didn't. And it kind of, it really tripped me up. And part of that, and this is something that like I wanted to kind of talk about is I, I I think like when we have our partner die, and like you said, like this whole identity, and you mentioned earlier, is like you go from caretaking, or from just, you ask your partner like, hey, what do you want for dinner, or what financial goals do you have, or what vacation do you want to take, right? Like all these things that we take for granted, that we're asking the person that we're spending our life with, whether married or partnered, every day.
Mhm.
Those things go away. But I did not stop asking Ariana.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I knew she wasn't here. I
Yeah.
understood that she was dead, but I was literally asking every day of like, hey, what about this? Or what do you think about that? Or what should we do there? Like I was still, for so long, and I still have moments of it
Oh,
where
yeah.
I was actively living as though she was still here. And there was a part of that too where I felt like I still needed to protect her. I still
Mhm.
wanted to know, is she okay? Whatever that means. Like I struggled with the fact that I couldn't be there to make where whatever she was going through, whatever was happening to her on after she died, I couldn't do anything about it. I lost control of being able to help her or
Yeah.
give her a better life.
Yeah.
So what are ways that we can still, because I remember we talked about this, but like what are ways to keep our loved one alive that are that's a healthy relationship to their death, and not this dysfunctional, really exhausting way to like still live as if they're living
Yeah.
with us.
Yeah. So, like, using that example, we can be like, oh, the caretaker, we could maybe separate that caretaker part,
Mm,
and of like, well, I caretake. This is what I do. This is
yeah.
what, and so by separating that part out and saying, like, thank you, thank you
Mm,
for stepping up over all these years and doing this, and um, providing Ariana with, you know, the best life, we could have over these past, 5 years, and, all of that. And
mhm.
so really like acknowledging the part that's like trying to still attach,
Yeah.
um, because that helps calm the nervous system, right? Um, and bring in some of that validation. And you can do a few different things. If it's like really causing problems, I would work towards being like, okay, well, we don't need that anymore. But what are healthy ways we can channel
Mhm.
giving, because also you might be getting from your system, like, it feels really good to like give to someone and care for someone. And so maybe it's also, is that feeling like I'm kind of missing doing that? What's a way that, does that part want to still do it? Or does it feel exhausted? Does it need a break? So it's kind of maybe like teasing out what's needed. And again, it can look so different on, on
Yeah.
everybody.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things with grief is there's no, I mean, I've read books, I've tried journals, I've tried all these different things, but there's no one a journey in grief. And I think I was fortunate to have a good support system. I was fortunate to have you there. I was fortunate to have my uncle who had walked through the
Mm-hmm.
exact things that I did. So while it's still devastating, and I mean, I'm still struggling to this day, it's only been 2 years. I at least had somebody to be like, hey, is this normal? And
Mm-hmm.
he's like, oh, yeah, I did. Right. So it's like there's these baseline things that everybody goes through in this type of grief. It's just the expression of it could look different. So we talked about transforming the relationship that I have with Ariana, from physical to spiritual, or whatever you want to insert
Yeah.
word there, but basically moving it to a new plane of existence
Yeah.
where not realizing that like we're not going to the grocery store anymore. We're not going to sit down and watch TV anymore. Like these things don't exist, but there's still a healthy way to relate and to honor her and to honor that relationship and let that be enduring forever, in a healthy way. So what are some of those things that we could do, from a standpoint of shifting that relationship, which is also then shifting our identity, because it's changing the way that we relate to somebody that we were probably the closest to of anybody in our life.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a big concept too, because like, if you want to use the word spiritual or something else, and that can be a big thing for us depending on what our belief systems are. And it can really be like, oh, so I think um allowing yourself to really explore that, because I've
Mm,
seen, a close death can often really change people's viewpoints, I've
yeah.
noticed. Yeah. So definitely like having an openness, and there's no right answer here, but really looking at, well, what feels right for me
Hmm.
would be a question I would, encourage people to ask. Um, and then the actual doing of things, So, like, how does it feel to go to the grave site if there is a grave site? What is that like? Does this feel connected? Does it feel not? I mean, it's going to feel weird, right? There's going to
Yeah.
be grief, but um, does that feel more connected versus sitting at a place? If you went to a park together all the time and you go sit on the
Hmm.
bench at the park, is that feel more connecting for you? Like,
Hmm.
I would invite people to play around with what that is for them. And then obviously, like if I were working with them, I kind of would know, like
Yeah,
it helps when you know someone,
for sure.
and then I can easily make a suggestion like, oh, what about this? Why don't you try that? Because I'll understand the relationship a little bit. But yeah, I'd invite people to really like play around as to what feels good in your system as a means of just like connection. I like the word connection.
That advice, and I've heard it before, of like just going after what feels good. What do you say to somebody who's like, well, I I can't, right? Like I need to do what's best, not what feels good.
mm,
Like, essentially like being like, well, I'm not going to, and this is not an example of like somebody in grief, but it's like, I'm not going to eat that chocolate cake because it's going
right,
to
right.
feel good. But
Yeah.
really what I want to do is go eat that plate of broccoli, and assigning these judgments to what's good or bad.
Yeah.
Like, what do you say to somebody who you may or may not have worked with, who always focuses on like, and pushes back against that notion?
Yeah. So again, there'd be a judgment call on my part too, of knowing the
Yeah.
person as, is there this attachment to the right thing. And
Yeah.
that's going to be about, what does that say about me? Right. Yeah, who am I as a person? Am I a good person or am I a bad person? And this is what a good person does. This is what a good widow does. This is what a good dad does. This is
Mhm.
right. And so so that's, I would just probably flip the conversation to working on that, because that's like its whole separate can of worms. But that's also a great example as to how a significant life event, such as, the death of a spouse, brings up all your inner shit,
Yeah. Oh,
like
yeah.
like if it's there, it's probably going to come out. So um and so I always kind of reframe in a weird way these, events force us to work on our shit and force us to do what we need to do. And and we grow as a result of that if we if we choose to do the work.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, honestly, I would just flip the conversation to that because it's probably your own stuff coming up. But there's something else I want to say too, though, because it is true that oftentimes we need to do what is required. Oh, so I like to use the
Hmm.
word required now. That's like a
Okay.
thing for me. um, as I work through all my own resistances and avoidances, you know. So if you know you're avoiding something, if there's an air of avoidance, so if it's not like this worthy, value, esteem, guilt, shame thing going on, then it could be avoidance. And so if you, and that feels different in your system, right? So then it's also kind of this self-awareness of what does avoidance feel like in my system versus shame feel like in my
Yeah.
system. Yeah. And so if there's avoidance going on, I would ask the question of, well, what's required of me? Not what makes me a good person, but what's required. What's going to lead me to the result that I'm wanting. So like you said, you used like the cake example, like the workout example, like, I know I'm going to feel good after my workout. I don't feel like working out right now, but I know I'm going to feel good. And I actually really do value my health and my body. So I'm going to work out even though I don't feel like it. So that would be like an example of if there's, if the, I don't feel like it is from avoidance versus if it's like, gut, that's just doesn't sit right with me,
Yeah.
if that makes sense,
No,
the
it does.
difference.
And I definitely felt that, or still do, but the notion of like do what feels good, or I think a better way to say it is do what feels right,
Yeah.
which allows room for this idea of like what's required, right? Like I had to get out of bed and I had to do laundry and I had
Yeah.
to feed the
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah.
It didn't feel good,
Right.
but it was what was required and it was right. And then there was other decisions too that I had made that, I had half of the people saying, "What are you doing? That's horrible. How could you do that?" And I had the
Right.
other half saying, "I'm so proud of you. That's
Right.
awesome. That's great."
Yeah.
And that's like one experience that was so vivid and is still to this day where there's no way that if I got 10 people together, that all 10 people are going to like the decisions that I make, right? Like
Correct.
for some reason, becoming a widow allows all of this judgment and people just feel like they can tell you all the thoughts and feelings that they have of how you're living your life. It's a very odd thing. And I'm sure
Yeah.
there's other
Oh yeah.
types
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
tragedy that people go through that
Yeah.
they have this experience. But it was
Yeah.
like all of a sudden I just had like, well, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And why aren't you doing this? Or why are you doing that? I
Yeah.
was like, what? Back the fuck up. Like
Yeah.
I'm doing the things that are right for my life right now.
Yeah.
And the other thing that came up too within that vein of doing the right thing, I remember being like sitting and just having this intense feeling of like I've held it together for so many years. Like I have been working through my shit. I have been working through my depression and all the other things that I've gone through. I have kept it together for my kids. I am providing. I have done everything that I could for Ariana, even though like I wish I could have done more and I beat myself up about it. And there was a period in time in that first year where I was like, I just want to just fuck off and be
Mm-hmm.
so destructive and just make horrible choices because I'm tired of holding it together. And I remember having those conversations and the thing that you said to me was like, okay, yes. So one of the best things that you told me is like find ways that are quote unquote destructive for your life but are very controlled and tiny, right? So going back to the food example, if you are somebody who always eats perfectly and you pride yourself on it, then go eat like shit for a meal and like get out that sense of like I need to not try to control everything and I need to just let myself be bad, applying that judgment to things and just find those small ways that are actually not truly destructive, but allow your system to feel that they are.
Yeah, it's like, because yeah, again, it's like identity too. Like I'm a
Mm-hmm.
healthy person, and
That's
healthy
right.
people eat this and this and that. And so sometimes you have to destroy
Yeah.
these beliefs about yourself, not because they're limiting you in some way, and yeah, I think I would say things. I'm like, you're not going to go murder someone. You're not
Exactly.
going to go like break the law. Like, you get to play around with these things, and then you get to decide. Then the next then when you do choose that healthy meal, you're choosing it with this really deeply known thing that, yeah, I do want this healthy meal because that feels best for me, and but you don't know that until you kind of like try out the other
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I like the idea of play. I think it's really important because you're so exhausted, right? Like I didn't sleep. I was sleeping like 2 hours a night for so
Yeah.
long,
Yeah.
and you're just constantly like triggered. It could just be literally a moment's notice, and this still happens, but it happens so often throughout the day where it's just like all of a sudden you smell something, you see something, you have a memory and you just break down. And the the act of crying all the time and trying to live your life and not sleeping and going through that grief, like you are exhausted. And I think the idea of play, in some sense, it frees you up to just get through each day
Mhm.
and try to find those ideas. And then, so to bring it back to identity, the other thing, and I'm curious kind of your thoughts now too, is for my specific situation, we were together for a very long time. But even if you're together for a relatively short period of time with your person, you develop these activities and these life patterns that you do together.
Yep.
Whether that's maybe you go play basketball together or work out together or go to a certain restaurant together or watch a certain movie, whatever it is. And it's the idea that when that person goes away, challenging, like, do I still enjoy these activities?
Hmm.
Are these still things that are a part of this new identity that I need to build? And then again, coming back to play, of like playing around with new things. Maybe
Mhm.
go rock climb, see how that feels.
Yep.
Maybe
Yep.
go play tennis. Maybe watch comedies if you only ever used to watch dramas, or maybe don't watch TV at all during the week, or read a book, like all these different things. Um, and that was something else that we worked a lot on too, of
Yeah.
trying to figure out that identity. But I guess the question is like, how do you even approach that when you're going through this? You're tired, you're exhausted, and you're like trying to play, and then you're trying to figure this stuff out. How do you even frame that to give yourself compassion while still moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, and you said something earlier too. I can't remember what, but the word like burnout, came
Yeah.
to me. And
Yes.
so it's good to, when we're recovering from burnout, we need to rest,
Mm.
right? So it's okay to rest as much as possible, and that the other part, is asking for help, right? So that you can
Hmm.
rest as much as
So hard.
possible. Which that's, so I would encourage people to kind of really do that first, to let their systems like recalibrate, and then move to the play,
Gotcha.
as that feels right. It's important to take that step though to move to the play, because that's when a lot of avoidance might take over if we don't, move forward. Because sometimes it's like, oh, I'm just gonna, that's when like the cake, oh, I'm just gonna eat this cake again, oh, I'm just gonna eat this cake again, oh, I'm just gonna eat, then we get like
Hmm.
comfortable eating the cake again.
Yep.
And so yeah, and I think that's where it is helpful to have a support person that can kind of like have eyes on you, that can be like, okay, I think, why don't you try taking a shower? Why don't you
Right.
try
Yeah.
going to the gym? Like, yeah, actually, a client of mine recently, you know, is going through some grief and stuff, and then it's triggering trauma and all this shit, and all this stuff's coming up for her. And I was like, you haven't been working out, have you? No, I know it's been a lot, but why don't you just try to do a little light exercise? Because I could feel like she was ready, and I could pick up that she was ready, but I knew she didn't know she was ready. And so it's really nice to have those people in your life that can nudge you in those directions.
Mm-hmm. How do you, or actually, let me ask, do you think it needs to be a therapist or a therapist-like figure?
That's a difficult question. Yes and
Yeah.
no. It's really helpful to have, the thing is, oh, you said something earlier about projection, but you didn't use the word projection, right? Oh, like when you said, if you become a widow and everybody judges your
Yes.
actions, and like everything you're doing, and like you said that, it's like, yeah, just go on Facebook and someone's like, I ate bread
Oh,
today,
yeah.
and people are like, oh my god, you ate bread today.
Yeah.
Like it's literally like anything you do, that's like, people are like assholes and just want to, but they're projecting
Mm.
their own shit onto you. So that's just the and I'm not saying friends, so friends and family, they're more likely to project their shit onto you, or if
Gotcha.
they're, you know what I mean, like there's
Yep.
so that's why I kind of struggle with that answer, but I also don't want to sound like, yes, pay me money to like support you. And so people know in their life like who those people are, and some people might have friends that can do that, and I think that's amazing. But I'm kind of going off on a tangent, but
No, that's okay.
hopefully
It makes
hopefully it's
sense. Like
helpful.
I do, it is helpful because I think it is a difficult question to answer. So from a patient perspective, and I guess like I should caveat this that I've been in therapy for like 15 years now, so I'm definitely therapized. But I do feel very strongly that having somebody who who can really dig in and kind of offer that non-judgmental feedback to you is so helpful and important. But I also say that and with the idea of like, for there are people who die suddenly, right? So we lose people suddenly, and to be in the midst of that and then to have to go find a therapist,
Mm,
I wouldn't like, that's disastrous. Like it's exhausting to find a therapist anyways, and to go through all that while you're going through grief can be very hard. So
yeah.
it could be helpful to have somebody kind of help you along in that process, to
Yeah.
find somebody. But I also, for me personally, I feel very strongly that I think there's many different needs of support. So I think therapy is one aspect of it.
Yes.
And as great as like the therapy was for us, like I think there's this other aspect of like somebody who has gone through it, who
Yep.
can kind of coach you through it.
Yep.
And maybe coach is the wrong word because it's a bit like overloaded in our society at this point, but somebody who can actually like take it from a moving forward perspective, whereas therapy can help you with all the shit that's coming up, like you mentioned.
Right.
And I fortunately had my uncle for a
Yep.
while to do that because he had been through that and he was able to
Definitely.
kind of be that sounding board for me. And I think without that, I think it's even harder to try
Yeah.
to get through it because it's so long lasting,
Yeah.
and society just wants you to be better. So I always get, hey, how are you? And what I feel is, hey, are you okay now? So can we just like move forward?
Mm,
Right? Like you're good, right? So like then I don't have to feel these things with you.
right.
And then they're like, hey, it's been like a year. You're good, right? So like life's great. It's awesome. Oh, you're dating. That's great. It's all over. But it's not. That's not how it works. But that's my
Yeah.
little rant about it.
Well, no, yeah, it's complicated. It's great if you have supports with people that have gone through
Yeah.
it, like your uncle. I think that was huge for you. Sometimes I encourage people to go, get that support. Sometimes they like it, sometimes they don't. It depends on. So it's also knowing like what do I as an individual want? What do I
Mm-hmm.
need? What do I respond well to? I've even encouraged people to go see psychic mediums, which
Yeah.
sounds like really weird. Like, why would a therapist do that? You know, because I've seen such amazing healing happen for people when they've done it, you know? So it's like, if that might be a thing for you, that might be a thing for you. So, and there's death doulas and yeah, grief coaches. And
I didn't know there's death doulas. That's cool.
yeah, I interviewed one in my,
Really?
yes,
Oh, that's
it's
awesome.
in my group if you want to watch it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll get you hooked up with her too. I think she'd be somebody good to consult with. And
Yeah.
yeah, so so I think it's moving in a good direction, a better direction. You know, people are starting to talk about death a little bit more. It's weird in our society, whereas if like, you know, in like an Eastern culture or what, it's so different. And I really hope in our lifetime we see a lot more normalization, I guess. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's the right word, around death,
Yeah.
honoring
Yep.
of death and the elderly and
Mm-hmm.
sick and, you know, like all of like everything that you see. And um it's like, I feel like it's a untalked about like
It is.
crisis in our
Yeah.
country.
Well, we hide it away, right? You go have a
Yeah.
baby in a hospital, you go die in a hospital, you're sick in a hospital. Like we used to
Yeah.
see that every day when we were like in villages and little communities, but it's we hide it, we push it away. I don't want to see
Right.
that stuff. I don't want to feel it. I don't want to know about it.
Yeah. You know, whereas it's like, and I know I've been kind of a weirdo. I feel like I've always been kind of like fascinated by death, you
Yeah.
know, like
Hmm.
I'm like, I hope I'm next to someone when they die. Like, and I know that sounds really weird, but it's, you know, I think it's really intimate, I guess, you know, and obviously, you know, you've experienced that. And yeah, but because people are so weird about it, they don't know how to approach it. And yeah, that's why you have these weird conversations when people are like, hey, you okay? They don't know. And so I
Yeah.
think I also want to offer to people like, you know, don't take that personally. It's, you know, they
That's a
just,
great point.
it's their discomfort. It's not anything wrong with you. It's, they don't know what to do and they love you, so they're trying to connect with you and they just don't know how, you know. And I think our society does get a little entitled, well, they should know how, and it's like, how the fuck are they gonna know how? They, you know, like, they're not gonna know how if they haven't
Hmm.
gone through it or
That's why
been
we're doing this.
educated.
Educate
Yeah.
society. Yeah.
Yeah.
So takeaways basically would be yourself,
Yeah.
right? Trust yourself. Know when you're avoiding versus when you're, doing what's right.
Hmm.
And then just really allow yourself to come into that new identity with
Yeah.
play.
Yes. Yeah, play around with it, you know, and honestly, that's a learning to take for the rest of your life because we are constantly changing as humans. And for some reason, we like to think that we don't change or we think other people shouldn't change. And it's the resistance to the change that causes suffering more than
Hmm.
allowing the, the change to
Interesting.
happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, let your identity to keep shedding and being born and being shed and being born, you know. I feel like I do this on a like monthly basis now, but I'm a
Hmm.
little weird. So,
Eccentric. Can we use the word
yes,
eccentric?
yes, yes.
That's the word I like to use instead of
Thanks.
weird. Though I'm weird in my own ways too, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, all right, that's awesome. And the last thing I want to touch on too was humor.
Yes.
I know not everybody does it, but I also know that it's a fairly common thing too. And the idea of using humor as a coping mechanism. So we joked all the time about Ariana's cancer, me and the kids,
Yeah.
the three kids, and we continue to joke about it. Last year for our photo session, I got a huge cardboard cutout
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Ariana, right? And we did
I
our
love that.
family photos with it. So we've always had it at the core of who we are. And I credit Ariana for that because she was so able to allow there to be laughter and lightheartedness around such a heavy topic,
Mhm.
and really allowed us as a family, right? Because we're looking to her like, you're the one dying. What is acceptable and what's not? And she really gave us that permission to say, this is normal and this is okay. And I'm just not sure that everybody gets that permission to do that.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to ask, like, humor as a coping mechanism, that is okay.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, that's a complicated, it's a little complicated. So, I guess I would just offer to weed through the difference of am I avoiding, right? That's another, am I avoiding, or am I, seeing it clearly? Because I do think when we look at the absurdity of life and all of it, it's kind of this funny show in maybe a
Yeah.
sick, twisted way.
So do you have like an example of what would be an avoidant behavior using humor, or using humor as an avoidant behavior versus as a coping or a way to have that kind of absurdity relationship with what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, so it's really about the pain underneath it, or if you're trying to, if it's because sometimes, like, if there's a lot of tension, we use humor to cut the tension, and so what's there about that tension that is intolerable, I
Uh,
guess, is what I would ask. So
I
if you're
see.
kind of trying to change the state
Hmm.
by cutting the tension with humor, then there's something deeper there to explore. Um, Versus like the energy of like listening to Alan Watts and how he talks and his humor and his laughter. It's just so impactful for me. And I think a lot of people, so does it feel like that humor, or does it feel like I don't like how things are feeling, so I need to change how
I
they're
see.
feeling in order for me to be okay right now, and then determine what is what. But yeah, so that's what I would kind of offer people to explore. But yeah, I've always enjoyed your humor around it. I loved when you told me about that,
Hmm.
photo shoot. And I love that reel you made with the she's
Oh
10,
yeah,
but
at
she's
the
dead. Like every
anniversary.
time,
Yeah.
like like it just came across my TikTok again, even though you did it a while
Hmm.
ago and I saw it on Instagram. It just like the algorithm came up and I like laughed again. Like I just love this so much.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I definitely have used humor to avoid, right?
Yeah.
Like, and for me, it came out as if somebody's talking, or there's a subject or a thing that I don't want to talk about, I will use a joke to change that subject and to change the energy and just be like,
Yeah.
haha, this is funny, move on.
Right. So what I would offer is, in those situations to have more authentic expression,
Mm,
to let what needs to be said.
yeah.
Because that's going to be more empowering, right? So yeah, so it's not that humor is bad. It's just in those situations, it can be like, I don't want to talk about this right
Yeah.
now, and then being okay with saying that I
Saying
don't want
that.
to talk
Yeah.
about this right now.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's just like, any opportunity to do work, I'm like, oh, here's an opportunity.
Yes. Subtleties. Whereas one night in Japan, it was the end of our trip, and it was our first trip after Ariana finished her first round of treatment. So it was right that first year she was diagnosed, and it was like my dream trip. I've always wanted to go to Asia. We went to Korea, Japan. So she was Korean, so like we wanted to go back to kind of where she was. She was adopted, and we were about 2.5 weeks into the trip, and we were sitting down. It was an amazing trip, and it was just us because we had traveled with our friends. But we were back at the Airbnb, sitting on the floor, and she was telling me how much she loved me, how awesome the trip had been, and how glad she was that we were able to do it. And then she was like, remember that phone call that I got right before we left? And I was like, yeah. She's like, it was the doctors, and I want to let you know that the cancer's back. And she paused. She kind of let me have my moment, and I like started to like get nauseous. I like couldn't believe that it was happening so soon. And then she was like, I'm just kidding. And the whole rest of the trip, I had to ask her, I'm like, wait, but are you serious? Or did you just say that because you know how hurt I was? And she just fucked with me so much. But that allowed it to just be this levity, right? And that's the difference that I really felt with like where we use humor versus where we use it as avoidant. But anyways, thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Pearls of wisdom.
Yeah.
And it was good. And thanks for helping me too for all those years and continuing to help me.
Yeah, I think you're an amazing example of doing the work. And I know you're going to help so many other people through these situations because you've done the work. And I think that's like the difference I was talking about earlier. When you're working with a support person, they need to have done the work, and that's what makes a big difference. Because if that person isn't consistently, being aware of their own projections, their own feelings, their own internal landscape, that's when the help isn't as profound. And so, so I'm excited for you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was awesome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Day After. You can find this podcast and more at our website at www.thedayafter.com. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast.